Welcome to Chapter 3 of A User's Guide to the Web, Search Engines. This is the finale of everything we've covered so far, so strap in for a ride and let's get into it. Google Search, Bing, and DuckDuckGo. What do all of these names have in common? They're search engines. You've probably heard of them before, but now it's time to understand their purpose, how they work, and the differences between each of them. We'll start by answering a question. What would the web look like if search engines didn't exist? Think back to the previous chapter about web structure for this one. Remember how websites in the deep web aren't searchable unless you know their exact URL? This is really the base state of the web, and if it weren't for big search engines like Google, the entire web would behave this way. Let's run an example of what this might look like. In some distant, search engine-less parallel universe, you're interested in looking up information about the war in Ukraine. Since search engines don't exist, it's not possible to simply look up facts on the war in Ukraine and see web results. As a substitute for Google, you keep an index of every website you've ever discovered, and your first step is to consort this personal index to see if any websites there can do the job. In all likelihood, however, you'll probably find that the websites you have just aren't going to cut it this time. Since that didn't work, you text a friend to ask if they can recommend any good news websites. They send you the following link. You type the URL into your browser and load the web page. Wow, it's almost completely dedicated to the war in Ukraine. It took a bit of extra effort, but you're really glad you found this website from a trusted source. You add it to your book of discovered websites and decide to use it as your primary source of global news. Okay, so there are two major problems presented by this reality. Firstly, the process of seeking out new information is incredibly difficult. Secondly, it's almost impossible to check the trustworthiness of a source. In the previous example, the website sent by a friend was called RT News. Had a search engine existed, it would have taken less than 10 seconds to discover that RT News is a Russia-backed propaganda source. Oops. Thankfully, we don't have to live in that reality. Search engines make our lives a lot easier. Okay, so the purpose of search engines is that they connect the web. But how do they do that? Though there was once debate over whether humans or robots could do a better job of cataloging the web, robots proved to be the only way forward once the web began to skyrocket in size. Thus, in today's world, the job of finding new websites from the deep web falls onto a fleet of bots called web crawlers. Each search engine has its own set of crawlers, and their job is quite simple. The crawler starts by loading a website that has already been discovered and uses it as a jumping off point. The crawler then proceeds to click on every link it comes across in that site and adds it to a queue of web pages to check later on. Once the crawler has clicked on every link in that original page, it opens up the first website in its queue and checks what parts, if any, the website owner allows to be collected by search engines. If the owner allows any pages to be collected, the bot will read through them and determine whether they provide beneficial information or are just spam websites. If the source is approved, it will eventually be sent home and stored in a search engine's index. Once the new website has been crawled and cleared for indexing by a search engine, this entire process repeats, and the crawler starts by clicking on links again. As of 2016, Google reported that it had indexed a total of 130 trillion web pages, which is insane to think about. Alright, now on to the big question. How do search engines determine which results get shown and which don't? Let's start with Google and Bing. Google is the king of search engines, controlling an estimated 72% of the market share as of 2020, measured by unique users. Since Yahoo has been completely powered by Bing since 2010, you could technically argue that Bing controls 15% of the market. While Bing is somewhat transparent with how it ranks websites, Google is very secretive. The one website they have is full of bubbly imagery and vague text. Thus, in searching for information about Google's system, I primarily referenced experimental results from a website called Search Engine Journal. Here are a few of the most important factors that Bing and Google both use to rank websites. 1. Authoritative backlinks. This is the number of times a website is referenced by another well-known website. and they're essential for establishing web credibility. 2. Content quality and user interface. This is vague, but the gist is that making your website worth visiting means that users will keep coming back to it, and that improves ranking. 3. Freshness. When a user looks up population of the world, there's no use for a result from 1998 to show up. Thus, up-to-date information is often prioritized over dated results. 4. Locality. If a user searches pizza restaurants, then Google and Bing both return a list of nearby restaurants, instead of randomly showing results from around the world. 5. Mobile friendliness. Roughly 54% of web searches nowadays are done on mobile devices. As a result, both search engines heavily consider whether a website is mobile friendly before adding it. 6. Optimization. From a study in 2016, Google determined that 53% of mobile users leave a website if it fails to load within just 3 seconds. Therefore, both heavily consider speed to be a ranking parameter. These are the 6 most frequently mentioned ranking parameters that I found on the web, but there could be anywhere from a few dozen more to a few hundred more. Only insiders know for sure. In timely news, the EU recently finalized its Digital Services Act on April 23, 2022. Which will require very large online platforms to explain their recommender systems under Article 29. The law will go into effect in 2024. Assuming you've not reached this conclusion yet, I really need to drive home one point. Search engines are not sources of objective truth. They're machines trying their best to sort through trillions of web pages in less than a second, and they're going to make mistakes. Thus, I highly recommend switching search engines to get a different viewpoint of the web on controversial topics. Watch Chapter 4, Configuration, to learn how to do this quickly. You wouldn't read a single newspaper if you wanted to hear all sides of an argument, and that same behavior should apply to search engines on the web as well. Now let's talk about the functional differences between each search engine from a user's perspective. In terms of answering really niche questions, Google almost always outperforms Bing. Take this question as an example. Why are there BBs on the beach? Google is smart enough to realize that I'm an idiot and recommends that I read an article about nurdles. Bing, on the other hand, has no idea what I'm looking for. It's technically my fault for not being more specific, but Google still wins for answering interpretive questions. However, while Google is the king of text search, Bing is the king of image search. Take this screenshot I took as an example. It's a lighting demonstration from a CGI program called Blender. The user interface here is tiny, so understanding the deeper context of this image is absolutely essential to displaying any relevant results. Impressively, Bing correctly identifies the screenshot I uploaded as some type of CGI lighting demonstration. Pretty good. Google, however, looks at my image and guesses that it might be related to the Department of Transportation, or DOT. Clicking on related images really isn't that much better either. In terms of privacy, Bing is considered to be slightly less invasive than Google, mostly because they don't have as deep an integration with advertising on the web. For users who sign into their Microsoft account for Bing, they can earn Microsoft reward points for doing searches. These points can then be used for one of two things. They can be donated as proceeds to any of the 1.4 million organizations that Microsoft has partnered with, or they can be redeemed for real-world gift cards and sweepstakes entries. Just as with Google, signing into a Microsoft account allows more data to be collected. But if you're okay with that in exchange for being part of Microsoft's rewards program, then by all means, take advantage of it. Google doesn't offer anything like this by comparison. The last major difference I see between these two search engines is the style in which they present search results. In recent years, Bing has become a lot more visual than Google. Let me show you an example. Searching for apple fruit on Google gives users a standard text page with an information panel on the right side. It's very simple. In contrast, looking up the same search term on Bing is almost like reading through an infographic. Microsoft's investment into image recognition has definitely helped them pull this off. While at first I was a bit overwhelmed by how colorful Bing can be, I came to like it over time. However, this is very much personal preference. Before we wrap this chapter up, I want to talk about that one other search engine. DuckDuckGo. DuckDuckGo captures only 0.42% of the global market share. but it's made a name for itself as being the most popular privacy-focused search engine in the world. The last 3 years have seen particularly explosive growth from DuckDuckGo, primarily due to increased public awareness over data collection practices by big companies. DuckDuckGo stands against data collection of any type, and they really want you to know this. Their entire website is basically dedicated to reinforcing this point. While DuckDuckGo has their own web crawler for finding new websites, they also pull search results from over 400 different sources, including Bing, but not Google, they stress. Thus, it's even harder to say for certain how DuckDuckGo's ranking process works, because their search results come from everywhere. DuckDuckGo's search results aren't as accurate as Google or Bing, but if your search questions aren't very technical, you may be willing to trade that benefit for an increase in privacy. DuckDuckGo's CEO was quoted in 2015 as saying, "If the FBI or NSA comes to us, we have nothing to tie it back to you." The search engine is so private, in fact, that the company doesn't even know for certain the exact number of users who use their service. For those interested, DuckDuckGo currently offers a privacy-focused browser on iPhone and Android, and they've recently begun development on a desktop browser for Mac and Windows, which will be launched in mid to late 2022, respectively. Congratulations! You've made it through all of the information videos in this series, and you're a better web user for doing so. I know it's been a lot, but it's necessary, at least on a basic level, to understand how any tool that we use on a daily basis works under the hood. There are no more technical details to cover, and the next chapter is simply titled Configuration. If you want to hear my recommendations for how to set up each browser, then click on the next video. But otherwise, you've made it to the end. Thanks for watching.